Okay, so like imagine you're back in biology class,
Hmm.
but this time it's just you and me,
Yeah.
diving deep into this whole world of gas exchange and respiration. No pop quizzes though, I promise.
Think of it more like a one-on-one session,
Yeah.
right? We'll explore how organisms, from the simplest all the way to the most complex, get the oxygen they need and get rid of CO2 too.
Exactly. We'll start basic
Mhm.
and then explore all the crazy different respiratory systems out there. It's a wild ride from like tiny single-celled organisms all the way to, well, us.
And the fascinating thing is no matter what organism you look at, the basic need for gas exchange is the same. It all comes down to cellular respiration. That process, that gives energy to every cell and, well, the living thing.
Right. Cellular respiration.
Huh.
So, can you remind me why oxygen is so important in all of this?
Well, you can think of oxygen as the key ingredient, right? It lets cells efficiently burn fuel for energy, and just like when you burn something, there's a byproduct, and that byproduct is carbon dioxide.
Okay, makes sense. So oxygen in, energy is produced, carbon dioxide out.
Yeah.
But how does that actually happen? Especially for those tiny organisms that don't have like lungs or gills.
That's where diffusion comes in. Let's take the amoeba, for example, a single-celled organism. Because it's so small, it has a really high surface area compared to its volume, meaning basically its whole cell is in close contact with its surroundings.
Well, it's like having a tiny apartment, right? It's easy to get to. But how does that help with, gas exchange?
Well, picture the amoeba surrounded by water, right? And the water has oxygen dissolved in it. Because there's more oxygen in the water than inside the amoeba, the oxygen just naturally it diffuses across the cell membrane and into the cell. At the same time, the carbon dioxide, which has a higher concentration inside the amoeba, diffuses out into the water. It's a simple process, just driven by those concentration gradients.
So it's like the amoeba breathes through its whole surface.
Yeah.
Pretty efficient for such a small thing. But if diffusion works so well, why don't bigger organisms, like us, just breathe through our skin?
Good question. As things get bigger, their volume increases much faster than their surface area. Think of like a small cube versus a much larger one. The bigger one has way more volume inside relative to its outside surface.
So it's like going from a studio apartment to a giant mansion. Things are a lot farther apart. But how does that relate to breathing?
Well, that bigger volume inside means there's more distance for the gases to travel, you see. Between the organism cells and the outside world, diffusion just gets too slow and inefficient over those longer distances. That's why larger organisms need specialized respiratory systems to make it work.
So it's like upgrading from a bike to a high-speed train, right? To
Yeah.
move those gases quickly through the body. Fascinating. So, okay, let's talk about some of those respiratory system upgrades. What are some ways that bigger organisms have tackled this challenge?
Well, one strategy is to maximize surface area, make as much as possible available for gas exchange. Take earthworms, they breathe through their skin. We call that skin respiration.
Wait, breathe through their skin. Isn't their skin like dry and rough?
Not at all. An earthworm skin is moist and thin. That's super important for gas exchange. Underneath the skin, there is this network of tiny blood vessels, capillaries. Oxygen from the air dissolves in that moisture on the skin, and then it diffuses into those capillaries, and carbon dioxide moves the other way.
So it's like their whole body is one giant lung. Incredible. But I'm guessing there's a catch.
You got it. Because they rely on most skin, it means earthworms are pretty much limited to living in damp environments. They can't go out into dry areas for too long, or else they'll dry out and, well, suffocate.
Makes sense. Clever solution, but with limitations. Now, what about aquatic animals? How do they breathe underwater using gills?
Gills are amazing structures, really. They're these feathery branching extensions. They create an enormous surface area for gas exchange, much like if you crumple a piece of paper compared to keeping it flat.
So it's all about maximizing that surface area to get as much contact as possible between the gills and the water, right?
But why is that so important in water specifically?
Well, water compared to air has way less dissolved oxygen. To get enough oxygen to keep up with their needs, aquatic animals need a lot of surface area for that diffusion to work efficiently.
Ah, so it's like trying to find a few grains of sand on a beach, right? The more beach you can search, the better your chances of finding what you need. I bet there's a lot of variety in gill structures too, just like we see with lungs in land animals.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Fish, for example, their gills are protected by this bony flap called an operculum. It helps create a flow of water over the gills, so there's always the supply of oxygen-rich water. Then you have things like clams, which use their gills for breathing and filter feeding. They're like multitasking marvels.
That's wild. So we've got creatures breathing through their skin, others with gills to get oxygen from the water. But what about breathing air on land? I mean, it seems easier at first glance, but I have a feeling it's not that simple. You're right. Breathing air comes with a big challenge: water loss. Remember, gas exchange needs a moist surface, and air dries things out.
Oh, right. It's like trying to keep a sponge wet in a desert, a constant battle. So how have land animals evolved a way to breathe air without drying out completely?
Well, they've developed adaptations, right? Ways to keep their respiratory surfaces moist while losing as little water as possible. That's led to some incredible evolutionary innovations, like a tracheal system in insects and, of course, lungs. Those are found in vertebrates, like us.
Okay, I'm definitely curious to learn more about those. Let's start with the insect tracheal system. What makes it so unique?
The tracheal system is this network of tiny tubes called trachea that branch all through an insect's body. These tubes connect to the outside air through openings called spiracles. They're like tiny doors for air to go in and out.
So it's like an internal plumbing system, right, for oxygen delivery. But how do they actually breathe? Do they have like tiny lungs that pump air?
Actually, no. They use muscle movements and body mechanics to change the pressure inside their bodies. Ever watched a grasshopper? You might have noticed its abdomen expanding and contracting. That's it breathing.
Whoa. So no lungs, but they use clever body movements to keep the air flowing. That's so cool.
Yeah.
But if it's so efficient, why aren't insects like bigger? Could this tracheal system be holding them back size-wise?
It's an interesting question. Scientists think that, yeah, the tracheal system might be a limiting factor in insect size. As they get bigger, their oxygen needs increase, but the tracheal system might not be able to deliver enough oxygen to support that.
Makes sense. It's like trying to use a garden hose to water a huge field, right? There just isn't enough pressure. Okay, let's move on to lungs. The respiratory organs that we air-breathing vertebrates have, but I bet there's more diversity in lung structures than we might realize.
You're absolutely right. Lungs come in so many different forms, it's incredible. But they all share three key elements: a moist respiratory surface for that gas exchange, a way to move air in and out, and a circulatory system to transport those gases.
Like a three-part harmony for efficient breathing. But what are some of the coolest examples of lung diversity out there?
Well, take frogs. They have these simple sac-like lungs, and they supplement their breathing with skin respiration and even gas exchange through the lining of their mouths.
Wow. So even within vertebrates, there's a lot of variation. What about reptiles? They live in some pretty dry places. How do their lungs measure up?
Reptiles, like snakes, they have more efficient lungs that are really well adapted to those drier environments. Their lungs rely just on lung respiration, so they don't need to supplement with skin breathing like frogs do. And their lung structure is more complex, with more surface area for gas exchange.
That's a great analogy. Their lungs are seriously built for those tough conditions. Okay, we've covered a lot here. From simple diffusion to complex lungs, it's obvious that nature has figured out some amazing ways to breathe.
It really has. And even with all the diversity, there's a common theme, the need for a large, moist respiratory surface, a way to move air or water, and that connection to the circulatory system for transport. Evolution at work, really, finding so many solutions to the same basic challenge.
It's incredible. It makes you wonder what other adaptations are out there, especially in those creatures living in extreme environments, right? But we'll have to save that for another lesson. For now, let's take a break, and then we'll come back and explore the human respiratory system in more detail. Welcome back. I'm ready to learn even more about respiration, but before we get to human lungs, let's go back to diffusion for a sec. Could you remind me how that works again?
Sure. Diffusion is basically just the movement of molecules. They move from a place where they're really concentrated to a place where there are fewer of them. It's like when you add food coloring to a glass of water, right? The color spreads out until it's all mixed evenly.
Right. Those molecules just naturally spread out to try and find a balance.
Right.
But how does that work with gas exchange in living things? I'm still not totally clear on that.
Okay, so picture our little amoeba friend again. Remember, it's surrounded by water, and that water has oxygen dissolved in it. Since there's more oxygen in the water than inside the amoeba, those oxygen molecules just kind of They naturally diffuse across the cell membrane into the cell.
So they move from where it's crowded outside to where there's more room inside. Makes sense.
Mm.
But what about the carbon dioxide? How does that get out?
Same idea, just in reverse. Carbon dioxide builds up inside the amoeba, right? Because it's a byproduct of cellular respiration. And since it's more concentrated inside, it naturally diffuses out into the water where it's less crowded.
So it's like a two-way street. Oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. All thanks to those concentration gradients. Pretty neat. We also talked about surface area being a big deal for diffusion. Why is that again?
Okay, think of it this way. If you have a tiny window, only a few people can squeeze through it once. But if you have a giant door, way more people can get through at the same time. Same goes for diffusion. More surface area means more space for those molecules to diffuse across, which means faster gas exchange. That's why those feathery gills in fish and that intricate tracheal system in insects works so well.
Gotcha. It's like adding more lanes to a highway. More traffic can flow smoothly. Okay, you also mentioned something about surface area to volume ratio, especially as organisms get bigger. Can you explain that a bit more? I'm still kind of struggling with that.
Sure thing. Let's imagine two cubes, one small, one really big. The little cube has a lot of surface area compared to how much volume it has inside. Now, think of each cube as a cell. That small cell, with its higher surface area to volume ratio, can easily exchange gases, because everything is close to the surface. But as the cell gets bigger, that volume inside grows much faster than the surface area does. So now there's more stuff inside that needs oxygen and makes carbon dioxide, but less surface area for those gases to move across.
So it's like trying to air out a giant warehouse through a couple of tiny windows. Not going to be very efficient.
Right.
That's why bigger organisms need those specialized respiratory systems, right?
Oh.
With all those folds and branches to increase surface area. Okay, that makes a lot more sense now.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of how form follows function. The structure of a respiratory system is directly linked to the organism's size and the environment it lives in.
All right, let's switch gears a bit. We've talked about how diffusion works and why surface area is so important. But are there other things that can affect how fast diffusion happens? Does, like, temperature matter?
You're right on track. Temperature is definitely a factor. Just think about how much faster sugar dissolves in hot tea compared to iced tea. Warmer temperatures mean the molecules are zipping around faster, which speeds up diffusion.
Oh, right. So warmer usually means faster gas exchange.
Yeah.
What about other things?
Well, the size of the molecules themselves matters too. Smaller molecules like oxygen and carbon dioxide, they diffuse faster than big, bulky molecules.
Yeah.
It's like trying to move through a crowded room. It's easier if you're small and quick.
I can see that. So those little gas molecules have a size advantage. What else can influence the rate?
The distance the molecules have to travel matters a lot. Shorter distance, faster diffusion. That's another reason why those thin-walled alveoli in lungs and those delicate gill membranes are so important. They keep those distances super short.
It's all about being as efficient as possible. Evolution has really fine-tuned these systems to get the most out of diffusion. Okay, one last question before we get to human lungs. You know how we've been talking about all these different respiratory systems, skin, gills, tracheae, lungs. Do they ever, work together? Can an animal have more than one system?
Oh, absolutely. We talked about frogs, right? They use their skin for respiration, especially when they're underwater, to help out their simple lungs. And some aquatic insects have both gills and tracheae, so they can breathe in water and air. Nature is full of these cool combinations.
So it's not always a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. That's wild. Okay, I think we've got a good grasp on diffusion, surface area, and all these different respiratory systems. Now I'm ready to zoom in on the human respiratory system. Let's see how our own lungs work. Okay, so human lungs. Time to explore all the details of our own respiratory system.
Let's take a little trip through that system, shall we? See how it all works to keep you breathing. Imagine taking a deep breath. Where does that air go first?
Well, it comes in through my nose and mouth, right? But then what?
Exactly. From there, it travels down this tube called the trachea. You might know it as the windpipe. It's like the main highway for air getting into your lungs.
Ah, the windpipe. I remember that from those anatomy charts. So the air goes down the trachea, and then does it just go straight into the lungs?
Not quite. The trachea actually branches off into two smaller tubes called bronchi, one for each lung, like a highway splitting into two separate lanes.
Okay, so the air is moving through the bronchi on its way to the lungs. What happens next?
Those bronchi keep branching, you see, like the roots of a tree getting smaller and smaller. These smaller branches are called bronchioles, and they eventually lead to these tiny air sacs. We call them alveoli.
Alveoli. Okay, now those sound familiar. I think I remember something about gas exchange happening there, right?
You got it. Alveoli are the stars of the show when it comes to gas exchange. They're all clustered together like grapes, creating tons of surface area inside the lungs.
So, maximizing surface area again, just like with those fish gills we talked about. But what's so special about alveoli? What makes them good at gas exchange?
Well, each alveolus is surrounded by a network of tiny blood vessels, those capillaries. Remember those from when we talked about earthworms and skin
Oh
respiration?
yeah, those super tiny blood vessels. Red blood cells have to squeeze through in single file, so they're important for gas exchange in our lungs too.
Exactly. It's all about how close the alveoli and capillaries are to each other. The walls of the alveoli are super thin, and so are the walls of the capillaries. That means there's a really short distance for the gases to diffuse across.
It's like having two really thin balloons pressed together. Super easy for molecules to pass between them. So the air we breathe in gets to these alveoli, surrounded by capillaries. Then what?
And that's where diffusion comes in, right?
Okay.
Oxygen from the air inside the alveoli, it diffuses through those thin walls and into the capillaries, and then it binds to red blood cells.
So the oxygen hitches a ride on the red blood cells? Where does it go then?
Those red blood cells, all loaded up with oxygen, they travel throughout the whole body, delivering that oxygen to all the cells, all those cells that need it for cellular respiration.
That's amazing. So every breath we take is basically restocking our oxygen supply. What about the carbon dioxide, though? How do we get rid of that?
Same process, just in reverse. Carbon dioxide, it's made by cells as they make energy. That carbon dioxide diffuses from the capillaries into the alveoli, ready to be exhaled.
Like a perfectly coordinated exchange program happening in our lungs. Oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. But how does all that air actually get in and out in the first place? What makes it move?
That's where our diaphragm and rib muscles come into play. Your diaphragm, it's this dome-shaped muscle, sits below your lungs. When you breathe in, it contracts and flattens out. And your rib muscles lift your rib cage up and out. That makes more space in your chest cavity.
So it's like increasing the volume of a container, right?
Yeah.
But how does that make air flow in?
Well, that expansion lowers the pressure inside your lungs, and that creates a difference in pressure between the air outside and the air inside. Air naturally wants to move from high pressure to low pressure.
Oh, like inflating a balloon. The
Oh.
air rushes in to fill the space. What about breathing out? How does that work?
When you exhale, your diaphragm relaxes, moves back up. And your rib muscles relax too, letting the rib cage move back down and in. This reduces the space in your chest cavity, which increases the pressure in your lungs, and that higher pressure pushes the air back out.
So it's this perfectly choreographed dance. Our muscles, pressure changes, those tiny alveoli doing their gas exchange thing. That's
It
incredible.
really is. And this whole process is going on all the time, you know? Even when you're asleep, you don't even have to think about it.
Wow. That's a testament to how amazing the human body is. Well, this has been an incredible journey. We started with those tiny single-celled organisms using simple diffusion. Then we explored all the different gills and tracheae. And now we've even delved into the amazing workings of our own lungs.
And it all shows how connected all living things are, and how evolution has come up with these amazing solutions to that basic need for oxygen.
Absolutely. It really reminds you that even though we take breathing for granted, it's this incredible process. It's what keeps us alive and functioning. So next time you take a deep breath, take a second to appreciate all that. The journey the air took to reach your cells, and all those muscles and organs working together to make it happen. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive